Honorable members, order.
Switch on the microphone. Switch on the microphone. We're rising on a point of order.
On a point of order.
The microphones must be on.
Welcome to Politics Unmuted, where our microphones are never muted and we turn up the volume on all things political. I'm Connecta Hunter, the politics editor for News 24.
I'm Lisa Gatandwa, News 24's political reporter.
And I'm Peter Du Toit, assistant editor for In-Depth News.
This week, journalists in South Africa found ourselves in a difficult situation. There were accusations and counter-accusations about journalists being part of factional political battles, and it spilled over into the public discourse. Social media was abuzz with finger-pointing emanating from a WhatsApp group that some political journalists were part of. Even the EFF weighed in, giving credence to a narrative that journalists were being used to extend certain political interests. And while the matter can be easily dismissed as just a WhatsApp group, I think it's important for us to take a step back and reflect. Any perception that we as the Fourth Estate is playing into the tune of political masters should be squashed. We are meant to be independent. We report fiercely, without fear or favor, but we are not perfect. We make mistakes. The South African journalism landscape has been fraught with revelations of how journalists were used to further certain narratives. We come from the era of the rogue unit, of the Katomena death squads. What happened then was that journalists did not take a moment to self-reflect. And sometimes it is important to take 2 steps back and ask ourselves, have we gone wrong? How do we navigate the fine line between journalism and its interface with politicians? And if we've gone wrong, how do we self-reform? The health of journalism contributes to democracy. Sometimes we have to ask tough questions. At what point do we self-reflect, and we need to self-reflect about the state of journalism in South Africa, the interaction or the crossroads journalism has with politics and politicians, and at what point is it just serving, the agenda of political formations to see journalists, eating each other up alive instead of focusing on the prize. And so, what are your reflections today?
Konita, first up, look, 3 things I want to say and just put out there. First things first, political journalism is very difficult. To write about politics in any country is, as a journalist, it's a wonderful thing to be able to do, but it's fraught with danger. It's fraught with vested interests and people who want to influence the narrative. And journalists' job in the political arena is not easy, because you have to maintain a contact base or a network of contacts across the political spectrum, and in this country, not only across the political spectrum, but across the spectrum of factional interests inside of the ANC. So that's the first thing I want to say. It's not an easy job. It's a difficult job. There's difference between covering policy and governance and government and internal party politics, and you lump it all together as politics journalism. So it's difficult.
And all sorts of journalism in South Africa somehow leads back to politics, right?
Everything is
Sport
politics, isn't it?
becomes politics. Health becomes politics.
So political journalism is difficult. The second thing I want to say is that I think there's been a sea change in recent times where, historically there has been a convention that you don't discuss your colleagues, or you don't criticize other outlets, or you don't when another outlet makes a mistake, it's hands off. You never go there. But I think that's starting to change, and it's
changed. Is
that
a good thing or a bad thing?
I think it's a good thing. It can be a bad thing. It depends on the motive of those criticizing and debunking stories. But I think that's changed. If you read Anton Harber's searing expose of what happened around the rogue unit, what happened around the Cato Manor death squads, it reads like a thriller. I read that book and I thought to myself, we tread a very fine line every single day, and we need to be aware of it. So that's the second thing I want to say. And then the third thing I want to say is that we are targets. We are targets of disinformation. We are targets of politicians who want, like I said earlier, want to influence the narrative. And we need to be aware of that. So that's my opening thing I want to say about this. It's a very difficult subject, and we spoke before on how we're going to handle this. Is it going to be too difficult? But it's a conversation that we have to have in this country. We saw what happened in the States, where the media became so part and parcel of the political environment that it threatened their democracy. So we should never become the story, but we should be able to talk about ourselves.
Because I hate having this discussion, just to put it out there. I think that there's a lot more serious topics going on in our country that we could be talking about this week. But I do think that sometimes we have to be a little uncomfortable to tackle these issues. Liz, what's your lay of the land?
Well, I am uncomfortable in speaking about my profession, but at the same time, I do understand the value and the necessity for us to self-introspect once in a while and recalibrate. And I think that in the world of politics, like Peter has just pointed out, that it is difficult to maintain one's composure when there's a narrative that is being driven by the sources that you have. In reality, every source that you speak to in politics, especially in this day and age, and especially with the political offerings that we have in South Africa, has an agenda that they want to drive. It's upon you to ensure that that you're not driving that agenda. You must ensure that it is in the public interest to know that particular subject or whatever they're giving you. So I think there's been a lot of talk around journalism, not just political journalism, in the past couple of weeks. And I think that there needs to be a conversation about journalism. There needs to be a conversation about the kind of trajectory that we're on, whether we are slowly becoming Americanized, as it were,
and whether that's a good thing or
whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. There is that discussion amongst journalists about journalists who thread that fine line, who walk that tightrope, and whether they are doing it for the benefit of the country, for the benefit of ensuring that the country is on the know and educated.
So where are we?
Where are we? Who?
In terms of journalism and its interface with politics?
It's difficult. I mean, it's such a somber discussion. Normally we are much more upbeat, when we record this. But it's a very difficult conversation because, like you said, it's difficult to turn the spotlight on your own profession. So when I go out there and people criticize journalism, I'm the first guy that says, absolutely, say, bugger, you don't know what you're talking about. Yeah. But internally, there's lots of criticism. We criticize each other. There is criticism of our... So where are we? And we're talking about political journalism specifically.
Not political journalism in its interface
with politics. Look, so my first experience with politicians trying to influence the narrative by influencing individual journalists, and then seeing that actually happen, was head of Polokwane in 2007, where you had the very influential Zuma faction clearly having a line to certain news houses, news organizations. And the Mbeki faction, ahead of Polokwane, trying the very same thing. I was in our newsroom in Parliament when the famous facts came through from Kusatu, I think it was, the Browse Mole report, which said that there's a plan to get rid of Zuma. So that was quite troubling to see, and that was a long time ago, and we're still seeing how politicians are trying to influence journalists. It's difficult. It's a difficult space you guys are working in. So where are we? I think it's good to hear Liz say that there's caution, there's an awareness, and I think there should be awareness of, it's, you want the scoop, you want the inside track, but how do you maintain a distance to be able to severely criticize politicians who in this country deserve a lot of criticism, don't they?
And just to bring it back to where we are in the political landscape, I think that we have characterized the political lay of the land as good guys versus bad guys. And so what happens when you have good guys versus bad guys, obviously as journalists, you on the side of the good guys, right? But in politics, whether it's the DA, whether it's the EFF, whether it's the ANC, whether it's Trump versus Biden, there is no good versus bad. And I feel like a lot of this pandemonium of where we are is because we want to be with the good guys, but there is no good guy. And so we create angels because we're so desperate to find angels because there's so many demons. Does that make sense?
It does, and it's a function, I would think, of years of state capture. You know?
Yeah.
It was very easy to see who the bad guys were. You know, they were looting the country. So whenever anyone stood up against them, often for their own political ends and expediency, it was like, you know, someone's at least. You know, when Julius Malema and the EFF came onto the scene, you guys would remember the ANC in 2012, 2013, 2014 they were this giant monolithic entity that immovable at the ballot box, Zuma immovable. It was almost Trump-like. And then Malema and them came and they just attacked and attacked and attacked. And they broke Parliament, yes.
To a large degree, as journalists, we clapped.
We did, because someone was challenging Zuma and making Zuma uncomfortable and making the ANC, because the DA were going through the Westminster, the Westminster route that they always do in the National Assembly, you know, doing what they need to do, yes, according to the political system, but it needed someone to break the deadlock. But did Malema and them do that because they believed in something higher? You know, I don't think so, but we did clap for them.
You know what, I just thinking back just a couple of months ago, or is it years ago, I can't remember, when Nhlanhla Nene went to the State Capture Commission, and how he was praised before then by both political journalists and political analysts for him standing up to the Zuma administration with regards to the nuclear project. And it feeds into what you were saying, Kanita, about having these holy cows and how we think that they are an anomaly to what is, and the bad guys, as it were. The reality is that we have to distinguish ourselves, that, you know, in politics there is no good and bad. There is no holy cows.
It's the human
nature.
Instinct.
You want
a hero.
You want to have that underdog or the hero of that moment. But in reality is that our lived experience should be teaching us better. But which is why I was saying that we need to be very cautious about where we are, because in journalism, what I've found in journalism in this day and age, in South African journalism, when I look at what we talk about on social media and what we talk about in the roundtables, and how we reference different political party players or political figures, there's always these perceived angels. And what scares me, I mean, you're Praveen Gordon's for one. What scares me is that does that play into our writing and also our questioning of those dominant figures. I remember when I was just a young journalist in Port Elizabeth, and Gwede Mandashe was Secretary General then, and he would come in and, there's a media briefing, and I would be so scared to ask Gwede anything because he's just such an intimidating figure. And, there's plenty of other journalists, young junior political journalists who might feel the same way. And that's the scary part for me. Does our actual ideas of who's who play into our writing, play into our questioning?
And then also it's the thing of, we hunt in packs. And so if this person is the villain, and for me, in my new role here at News 24, I'm very cautious about that, in a way that to what interests, to what, let me take a tangible example of the internal factionalism in the ANC, right? And you are caught between a rock and a hard place, because it's not only political interests fighting each other. It's actually like an organized crime syndicate of sort, And so as fair as you want to be in giving the other side of the story of Ace Magashule appearing in court and saying that the charges against me are a political ploy, at the end of the day, we've been through this long enough to know that you can't just give his side of the you can't give his side of the story, because his side of the story is a lie. This is not about protecting the interests of the president or protecting the interests of a certain dominant faction. It really is that in this case, you are on the wrong side of the law and we are going to report it as such.
Is there a backlash to stories like that you do? I mean, if you are like I said in the beginning, you have to maintain a network of contacts across the board. So that means you have to maintain, and political journalism
You have
in
to
this
have
country.
lunch with rogues.
Yes, you have to, but it's difficult. It's different in this country, and we all follow the American election now. I mean, the stuff that Maggie Haberman, for example, wrote on the New York Times, critical of Trump, but then he still calls her, even though she's extremely critical. It's in this country that often doesn't happen. When you're critical of someone,
It does. It does happen in the ANC. I think it takes a lot of political maturity. And we've seen a lot more, politicians being, sensitive. You see it in the DA, you see it in the EFF. And I think that it's a difficult terrain. So let's distinguish, right, Peter? The one thing is the healthy tension between politicians and journalists. We shouldn't be their friends. There needs to be this tension. It's very good for democracy, right? But then it's the what we see, or what I've been seeing, I don't know, you guys can disagree with me, where there's almost like these fires that are lit among us as journalists as politicians clap.
and
that worries me.
Yeah, it does, because dividing and ruling is an old trick of them. And if journalists play along with that, then it's easy for the politicians to attack journalists and attack the integrity of journalists. And then journalists start turning on each other.
So do we
and then we miss the stories.
So at what point, where's the platform for us to say, let's check ourselves so that because
we can't police you can't write about, we can't. And I get what you're saying. So for example, the Sunday Times leads with one story. Let's take the Sunday Independent story from this Sunday about Bushiri, which wasn't sourced.
Yeah.
What do we do with that story? Ignore it, fact check it, report that it was reported, because they reach an audience. IRL reaches a very large audience. And do we take responsibility for other newspapers and mistakes?
Yeah.
What happened with the Rogue Unit? The Rogue Unit was something that got a life of its own. It just ran for years and years and years until, some in the media said, but look, this isn't right. But again, it comes back to a tradition or a convention that we used to have, that you don't criticize your colleagues at other media houses, and I think it's changing.
And now when people are criticizing each other, I feel like it's not based on journalistic principles and ethics.
Yeah.
It's not.
It's
I'm not
personal.
pointing fingers at you. It's personal,
Yeah.
and it's an extension and a spillover of factional fights and political fights with media houses, and that for me makes me really upset.
And then the politicians say, it goes to show that you are part of a certain faction. Like we saw this week. That's a good example.
But do they have? I believe that where there's smoke, there's fire. Because I have identified that there are some journalists, or there are traits within some journalists where journalists are more favorable to a particular faction or
So how do you solve that?
publications. I don't know.
So
I don't know,
I'm more interested in being constructive about it instead of going and firing. And I'm not attacking you in any way, but firing on social media, for example.
That's totally counterproductive. Social media, to take that debate to social media.
But I mean, it happens, and I've participated in it before, and etc. But also, me and you have agency. A younger journalist may not have that level of agency in a newsroom to raise issues. But the point is that I am more interested in. We've come from a Rogue Unit era, right? We've come from a SABC political interference era. How are we constructive about it? Instead of this thing of we literally just killing each other, shooting at each other, in a way that is just making the people that we need to be focused on applauding and sitting at this dogfight and eating popcorn and fanning the flames. I'm using all cliches possible, but do you understand what I'm saying? And for me, our industry is only being decimated. It's being decimated because of finances. It's been decimated. COVID has killed a huge part of journalism in this country. And the thing about state capture is that it showed us that when every institution of the country was literally torn apart, it was the media and the courts that literally held our democracy up. And so there's no winner in this. There's no winner in me sitting here and be like, Liz, why are you, this Tumamina WhatsApp group and, Q, you are Ramaphosa Kaba, and Peter, why are you writing that Malema's Eugene Terblanche, when at the end of the day, yes, I can have a valid criticism of you, Peter, that I think it's counterproductive for someone like Liz who has to cover the EFF for you to make that statement about, I can disagree with you. But when it spills over, there's no winner. So what do you do?
I have no
Look,
idea.
I think there's no way that you could influence what happens at the Sunday Times or
Can't police each other.
anywhere else. There's just no way. What you can do in this sphere of influence, which is your newsroom and your environment, I mean, that's where you can build journalists into maintaining a strongly principled sense of ethics, I think. So where does your allegiance lie? It needs to lie with your reader and the Constitution and the press code, I think. When I speak to my investigative team, we say, it's the Constitution and the press code, and, we need to inform readers. That's all it is. That's what I think about how we can do it. You need to know why you do this job, who do you do it for? And the one thing I think is so important is to maintain a professional distance from people that you write about.
Yeah.
That's what I think.
Which
it's
is
difficult.
very hard.
It's difficult. But you have to be able to do it. It's not easy. And look, we're all journalists, and the one thing about this profession is you are learning every single day on the job. The moment you think you've got this sussed out, it can kick you up the ass and say, look, you are over your head. So it's about remaining humble, I think, and then just knowing exactly who you're writing for. That's what I think.
So I'm thinking of the listener listening to this podcast. Why should they care, right? About the dramas that's going on in newsrooms and in journalism. But for me, we trade on public trust. That's the currency that we have as journalists. And I think that by having this uproar, by having these finger pointings and this sort of factionalizing of the political journalism space, I think that it does a huge disservice for why we exist, which is to serve the readers and to do that country duty. And so at the end of the day, when I say there's only going to be losers from this public spectacle of us trying to tear each other down, it's because we're diminishing the public trust that we really need. Without public trust, there's no journalism.
But that's also not to say that we can't have healthy debates and criticism of each other.
So how do you do that? And where do you do
that's the trick, isn't it?
Yeah.
To do it from like Conita said earlier, not from a point of personal vengeance or whatever, or jealousy or whatever. It needs to be grounded in fact. And, you said it earlier, seeking a solution to whatever the problem may be. But guys, these debates on Twitter that we sometimes see, people attacking each other, journalists nailing each other, I just don't see any value in that. And that's almost, I feel, what I see is that's almost where the debate, in inverted commas, that's where it happens. And there's no real debate there,
But then the other point is the plurality of views. Are we becoming less tolerant of just people having divergent views? Are we becoming less tolerant of people who have views that are not sort of consistent with what our worldview may be?
I think it's just the world, how the world is in nowadays. I don't think that it's primarily within this little sector that we have, the fourth estate.
Our little world.
Yeah, but it's like that. We're growing into where you are so intolerant of someone else's views. I think it's just what is happening in the world with the introduction of social media. I do think that as journalists, we are still, I think that we have to give each other credit, that we are still able to, when I come to Peter and I tell him, Peter, I don't really agree with this column that you
Peter,
have
we're not
written.
picking on you.
Feels like it.
I don't
We're not
really
picking on
agree.
you.
We still have that scope where he's able to listen to me, and he'll even say, no, why don't you write something that can reach out to people and you can actually give your own view. I do think that as journalists, yes, social media, there's this monster called social media that has taken over, but I think we have a long way to go till we come to a point where we have tensions from just hearing each other's point of views.
Peter, your final thoughts?
I agree with Liz. I think there's a great intolerance of divergent views, and we're seeing that on social media. And I think it is playing out in what we often read in our news publications. So I think that's the way where the world is there at the moment, a hardening of views, and the middle ground is just growing smaller.
That's all we have for you. I hope this has been insightful. I think that it is a moment of reckoning. It was a difficult podcast. We're usually much more fun and upbeat. Next week, we definitely will be. From all of us at Politics Unmuted, thanks for listening. This episode was produced by my colleague Catherine Rice and recorded by Shantae Schatz. The music was courtesy of Getty Images and Epidemic Sound. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe or follow the hashtag Politics Unmuted.